I am Racey Padilla. I'm the plant breeder for Triticale Superior Forage. We are a company that is 90% of our business is focused on breeding triticale. I do work with other small grains. I develop forage wheats and forage barleys. Worked slightly, just a little bit of dusting in there with Austrian winter peas as a side project because I don't know. I don't know how to say no to the people above me that ask me if I can breed other crops. So, um, but we're pretty focused on triticale. We have been since 2015, and my research facility is located in Texas. I have a crew of 3 people there that helps me get all of our trials and testing done there. But we actually do testing across the entire U.S. Matter of fact, I am here today as day 16 of being on the road, away from my family, planting up here because it's been planting season for a while. So we started in Kansas and worked our way all the way through the Midwest and planted all over Michigan and Wisconsin, Minnesota, and all the really cool, beautiful states that actually have trees and water. So it's been quite interesting, but it's been a bit of a long period. I'm ready to get back home pretty soon, and so we can start planting the South. But we plant about 26 states for testing at least every year for yield trials, just trying to figure out what varieties work best for which region. So it really helps me find a fit for varieties for the areas. I'm going to talk through, maximizing total annual forage. This is basically just a topic that I want to share my experiences with triticale. If you've grown wheat before, there's a lot of similarities to it, but there is some caveats between triticale and wheat where we found that if you do things a certain way with triticale, you'll actually boost the overall forage yield, and a lot of that's just got to do with because it is a forage crop. So there's certain things you can do to make it better for the forage side of it versus trying to produce seed like you do with wheat. Um, so as we kind of take a step back, I'm going to say in 2010 we took over the Triticale program and we really started looking at how to maximize our acres and how we could really offer better opportunities to farmers and where Triticale really has a fit. At that time, most of the triticales were predominantly grown in the plains area of the United States, and just because there was not enough breeding focus, you didn't really get much offering for the Midwest, the Northeast, and other parts of the U.S. So when we took a step back and said, "Man, where do we fit in the grand scheme of farming?" Um, and we got to really looking at all the corn acres and decided, the corn acres, we see a lot of them, and this was just a focus initially in the Great Plains. At that time, we were a little smaller company, but as we started focusing the Great Plains and saw all the corn acres that were going in, and they would harvest, they were either grain or silage. They'd pull their corn off and harvest that, and then they left that ground bare or fallow for the year. We started trying to figure out, okay, why is that a practice, and why is that a normal practice, and why don't they put something else on it to maximize their acreage or their acre for the year? So we started doing a little investigation, and we decided, I think we can actually maximize the forage specifically, probably better than we can a grain acre. But when we said, well, how do we do that? Well, let's go in there and look at double cropping. And so we did some research and figured out that double cropping actually is probably the way to go because if you're looking at the overall tonnage that you could maximize, why not use triticale in that method? So why double cropping? To answer a few of these questions, if you look at double cropping, add in with triticale and corn specific, and that's all this that we've really looked at really closely and it probably fits best with corn, or if you have a sorghum model, that's okay too. That kind of fits in the same scenario, but mostly corn and triticale. You can increase your overall tonnage for the year by 25 to 35%. So you can get 2 to 5 tons of dry matter of additional high quality forage that you would not be getting if you left that ground fallow. And usually, when we started in on that, we got some adoption from it, and they were growing it, and they were letting it grow, all the way to late, not late boot, but like full heading all the way to soft dough stage. And they were getting lots of tonnage, but that was becoming dry cow feed. So I started, we did a little more investigation. Said, man, you guys really you need to harvest this at a sooner stage. If you harvest this at a sooner stage, this does not become a filler feed for you or fiber. This becomes a high quality product. And I'll talk a little bit about that moving forward. But you can get additional manure management. That's going to vary from state to state because some we'll talk a little bit about manure, but I just have really started touching on this manure management side of it and really trying to figure out what works best in certain aspects of it. And I'm just still just we're just trying to learn the process and how that benefits. And then building soil health, and the soil health side of it is probably geared more towards cover crops, or just having that second crop in the ground with the double cropping system, and fiber and in the ground root system for the whole year. It tends to build your soil health. So let's talk about maximizing. So we did a study with the University of Cornell. Oh, this is some years ago, but we did some talking with them. Said, okay, we're going to do the double cropping system. We got to put some real numbers to this. What does it mean if we can do it? We know we can do it managing it, but what are the numbers? Does the numbers come out to be for it to be profitable and something that the growers can actually use, other than us saying you should just do it because we said so? So what we looked at was the difference between I mean, I don't have enough information on here. Most of my slides got a lot of numbers on it, and you can get really lost in the numbers. I'm gonna give you the general gist, and if you feel free to take a picture of it if you really care about the really in-depth numbers. But what we figured out was the difference between 105-day corn and 85-day corn was about a loss. So the difference between you planting 105-day corn and an 85-day corn is you give up approximately a little over 1 ton of dry matter per acre potential. Okay, so I understand why most systems would plant a later corn if you could, because it makes more sense. You want the highest yield, and that's true for even for small grains. The later maturing varieties always out yield the early maturing varieties. It's just it's simple physiology of plants because it has a longer time to grow and develop and make a larger plant. Uh, but what we decided was, okay, if we back that down to the 85-day corn and added triticale to the system as a double cropping system, then you could add up to, again, 25 to 30% more biomass for the year. And this little piece right here is this is based on flag leaf harvest, which is the higher value product of triticale when you're actually harvesting it. So you could potentially add 2 to 4 tons of dry matter, and that number is actually a pretty real number, especially for the Midwest. And we'll go in a little more detail on that, but you could add that higher value for the year, and you don't have just fiber in the pile, or you're not just feeding dry cows. Now, if your overall goal is you need dry cow feed, be my guest, because that number will turn from 2 to 4 pounds to 2 to 4 tons to 4 to 6 tons, because you'll probably want to take it later. But this was the model that we came up with. We did this study several years back to back and basically produced the same results. And that's when we're like, all right, this is actually a legitimate process that you can actually add to your farming practices every year, going triticale to corn back to back. And we have a lot of customers that have switched over to that model, and they've been doing it for 6, 7, even up to 8 years now, and they really like that model. Now, the caveat is the corn maturities, again, are going to have to fit your region, what works best for your region. And what we found working up in the Midwest here is you guys' winter prolongs for so long. I think you have like 60 really good growing days for small grains. And what we figured out was the later maturing varieties that we were actually selling in the Great Plains will not work up here because they don't have enough time to get enough biomass. So we started looking at varieties, maturities, and we actually found a few varieties that are really early maturing and fit perfectly in that double cropping model and can give you that 2 to 4 tons per acre. So the biggest takeaway with that is if depends on what area you're going to be in, know what corn ish what corn maturity you're going to grow, and then we can help you kind of fit in the right triticale to fit your model to do double cropping in your area. If you guys have any questions and like come boom, I got a question, feel free to ask right away. I don't like saving them to the end because you may not ask. You may be mad because I'm holding you from your coffee break or your. But go ahead and ask the question right away. I don't mind stop talking for about 5 minutes. I threw this up here, and this is a trial we did last year. This is about for the Wisconsin people here. I don't. I call this Central West Wisconsin. You can correct me if that's not the right location, but we did a trial there, and really, this was to illustrate historically rye, and rye is a dirty word for me, but rye is has been historically the go-to for double cropping or cover crop up in this area. A lot of it's got to do with. Don't get me wrong, I get it. It's cheap and it's readily available. But if you're looking for a higher value, higher quality product, Triticale is the answer. And I've spent a good 12 years now developing Triticale, trying to beat rye. Rye has always been really tough to out yield. Still is tough to out yield in certain aspects because it's really tough. It's relatively vigorous in the spring. Um, sorry, in the fall, and then it continues to stay vigorous in the spring and kind of takes off and really turns the horsepower on in the spring. So historically, we've had trouble trying to out yield rye, and over a good hardcore 12-year press, I've basically finally developed varieties that it can actually out yield or compete with rye. Um, this doesn't look really cool, but this is a big chest beat for me. This is this was the year that I finally like, man, we got it. We did it. We figured this out. So as we continue to develop our genetics, we keep pushing these varieties, these genotypes as backgrounds together to try to even make that a bigger gap between rye and triticale. Gainer, that is the one that's probably the highest selling variety in this area. That's the pretty much the go-to because it is the earliest maturing variety in this part of the U.S. These there's two experimentals here that are okay. One of them's actually onless, so we get a little bit of a yield drag with onless, but it also is an early maturing variety. We did it, Mom. All right, manure management. I'll throw all this up here. All right, manure management gives you an opportunity to manage your manure. I understand there's so many different practices for manure management. Every state has their own regulations, well, what you can and can't do, how much you can put out. So that's why it kind of makes it hard for me to try to figure out what the right process, what the right answer is for numbers and kind of where we offer the advantage here. But this is basically what we know everybody knows. Probably you guys probably know manure better than I do in this room, but what we know is stockpile manure is roughly a 1-to-1 ratio for N and P. So for every ton, this is just rough numbers, general numbers. You get 25 pounds of N, 23 pounds of P, and that's that's a problem because when you try to throw out a so many tons of manure, 4 or 5 tons of manure per acre, and try to get rid of all your manure, you're actually adding so much P to the ground that crop cannot utilize because most crops need a 3-to-1 ratio. They need 3 times higher nitrogen than they do phosphorus levels. Some of them can do 8-to-1. But the elephant in the room in this scenario from manure management is phosphorus. And the fact is, phosphorus is not water soluble, so it's not the water soluble means it's not mobile in the ground. It won't leach as efficiently as nitrogen. Sometimes you get if you got nitrogen, excess nitrogen, water soluble, it can move in the soil and it can actually because it's water soluble, plants can actually get to the nitrogen more efficiently too. Wherever that phosphorus is, it stays there for the most part in the soil, and the roots have to grow to that segmentation of of soil to actually utilize it and take it up. And it becomes a problem that's a problem because when you get rainfall and you start getting erosion, because it's not water soluble enough that if there's any soil movement from topsoil going into a water source, phosphorus goes with it, and so it doesn't have an efficient way of getting it out of the soil. So using the triticale with a high fibrous root system allows you to actually take up phosphorus more efficiently rather than some other crop that's got just a tap root with some few fibrous roots versus something that's high fibrous root system. So um, the other the other thing is there's some if you get to phosphorus levels that are too high, there is some zinc and iron, calcium deficiencies, and some of those can be they can be misdiagnosed in some cases because they think they have a nitrogen problem and then they actually have a phosphorus problem or a high phosphorus problem because they've been using manure so heavily and they haven't been utilizing other plants to try to kind of remove it. All right, but there's a lot of within the soil. There's a lot of organic pee available. There's also inorganic pee. Organic pee, which is like dead plants, animal residues, so on and so forth. Those are not available to the plant to take up. There has to be a whole process that goes through without getting real scientific and boring. It basically has to go through a process where it breaks down and turns into organic pee. There's all kinds of mineralization. It's through mineralization process for all the science nerds in the audience. If you want to look at mineralization, you can bore yourself to death looking that up. But basically, it's just a process that happens in the soil for it to be available. Luckily, 45 to 75% of the pea in manure is actually already in inorganic form, which is readily available to the plant, which makes manure obviously the greatest source for phosphorus. But again, a plant can only take up so much phosphorus, and if it's in excess, you're going to continue to see the problems. So the only way to efficiently remove phosphorus is actually by mechanical harvesting. So if you grow silage, hay, you, once you've grown that, whatever phosphorus that it could pull in that plant at that time, you cut it for hay or silage. You have effectively removed phosphorus from the soil and moved it somewhere else. Um, I like cover crops for various reasons, but cover crop is not always the best way to remove phosphorus because if you are actually terminating that crop by roller crimping, burning down, whatever you want to do to that to get rid of your residue, if you're putting it back into the soil, you've actually just taken the phosphorus level that was in the plant and put it right back into the soil, and now it's organic phosphorus that will have to go through mineralization again and to be utilized. So you're not effectively removing it. I'm not saying that's a I'm not I'm not promoting we got to cut and get everything off the ground, but if you have a phosphorus issue, the only way to effectively remove it is to actually remove the plant above ground plant matter, feed it to a cow, and then you got the whole cycle again. Okay. Triticale can pull about 15 pounds of pee per ton of dry matter. If you're shooting for 2 to 4, realistically, 2 to 4, some areas up here can get 6 tons of dry matter. That's uh, simple math. You can just figure out what pea you can actually remove with triticale. The advantage is, once again, if we have a crop that can out yield other crops, you're removing more pea because there's more tons there to remove more pea. So you're welcome. Grow triticale. All right, I'm gonna throw this up here real quick. Gonna be a 2 minute speech because I get this question. I know there's some people maybe in the audience that don't have manure that their practice is just is using just dry fertilizers or inorganic fertilizers. But I get the question a lot. well, what should we expect to use? What do we need to put on? And this is just an example of what how to manage that. So for uh, for every ton that you want to produce, you basically need to Triticale use 50 pounds of N and 10 units of S. And I'm going to talk really in depth with S here in a little bit, but S is just sulfur. So you can produce 1 ton of of 16% crude protein dry matter. That that 16% is the bottom side of what we see with the flag leaf stage harvest. We can get as high as 18% in some years if somebody's really good at slinging fertilizer. They can get 20% in some years, but 16% is probably closer to the bottom average, not necessarily the average of what we've seen so far. Recommendation: apply 1/3 of it in the spring, 2/3 in the fall. You do split applications in the fall. Depends on if you're doing liquid. You want to be real careful you don't burn the plant, and set it back a little bit. But basically, just an example on there. If you're looking for a 2 ton dry matter goal, you need 200 pounds of N, 60 pounds of P, 40 pounds of S, so on and so forth. Like I said, there's a lot of in-depth numbers. I got real numbers for you. I don't want to talk any more about them because you get a little bored and lost in it. But y'all can take a picture of it if you want to. And the warning is, do not apply fertilizer in snow-covered ground. I didn't think this was an issue. I didn't know it was an issue, but I have seen it a couple of times, and you'll lose, 44% of your nitrogen through volatilization when you put it on with snow cover. Um, I think part of it comes to just been snowed in all year and you got nothing to do and you really got to go around and drive your tractor. Maybe just wait. Maybe do something else with your tractor. Go to town and eat lunch, but don't sling out fertilizer because you're going to waste a lot of it. Planting methods. Oops. This is up here because I get the question a lot. Can I sling this on in my standing corn stubble? Yes, you can. It's effectively will grow like rye. I know that's a practice in some areas where they sling it on in their corn stubble. It's a practice of slinging on rye because rye is really cheap. So you can plant 200, 225 pounds the acre, and you'll get about a 60% stand, and that's enough, to call it cover. But if you're going to sling on triticale, you're not going to find triticale as cheap as rye for the most part because we are selling it as a premium product. We're breeding, developing it to become a premium forage product. So my recommendation is please don't sling it on. Use a planter and make sure you get a good seed bed, get good soil contact. Now, with that caveat, there's some guys that are really good farmers that I have as customers that do still sling it on, even though I beg them to buy a planter. But they do still sling it on, but they're really, really good at working the ground, slinging it on, cold packing, so on and so forth. It's been successful with them. I'm just going to stand up here and tell you I don't recommend it, but it can be done. All right, planting depth. Again, if you've ever planted wheat, or rye, you can plant triticale. I recommend one and a quarter inches to 2 inches. That sweet spot is an inch and a half for me. When I plant my trials, I shoot for an inch and a half. Um, the biggest deal for me is, especially up in the areas where you get a shrink swell, you got that from freeze thaw. When it freezes, then it thaws, it freezes, it thaws. If you don't have your plant in the ground far enough, that crown, which is the top portion of the plant that's right at the soil surface, if that's not developed enough, and because you didn't get it in deep enough, it will heave that plant out of the soil. I can't tell you how many times I've seen this, and it was just bad farming practices where they didn't take the time to get the seed prep or the planter set right, and they only planted it. And I can actually tell early on how deep it is because when I dig plants, I can tell you how I can look at the coleoptile and look and see how long it is and tell you how far you planted. So you can do the same thing if you want to check after you've already planted if you did it right. But I would recommend just planting it in the right at the right depth. All right, seeding rate. Historically, small grains has been talked about as pounds per acre or mostly pounds per acre. I think historically they've been planting, 175 to 100 pounds per acre. That's what a lot of people were doing. And then as I started looking at triticale as a crop, because I focus on it so much and other people don't, I started noticing that triticale is actually highly sensitive. The test weight is highly sensitive to the area that they develop and grow the seed in. And because we're growing so much seed in so many other parts of the U.S., the seed size is significantly different in those areas. And a good example is I developed a experimental that in an area that I thought was fantastic, and then I started moving it across the U.S. and it looked terrible, and I could not figure out. I thought it was stand issues. I basically started blaming. It's like this variety just sucks anywhere else. It can only be planted in this one state, and it's garbage everywhere else. But I went back and started doing stand counts the next year, and I found out that the stand counts were significantly different or off from what we thought we were planting. So when we went back and looked, Thor is the variety that came out that I thought was garbage after I grew it outside the region where we select it from. And what I found out was it's got really huge seed, um, 64 test weight seed. That's pretty big seed for triticale. Triticale is usually around 48 to 50, but this was a big behemoth seed, and everywhere I grew it, it was like that. So we started evaluating all of the triticale varieties and noticed there was a massive variation between variety specific. And I think a lot of it's got to do with breeding, because in the wheat world, you breed for test weight, because as soon as you sell it across the scales, that's the first thing they test in there, and they're going to dock you. They're looking for any reason to dock you, and that's the first thing they pull a sample of, and they can actually dock you right at the scales. Triticale is not grown as a commodity. So we don't look at test weight as heavily for that reason. So it's probably a failure of us breeding and not developing genetics for it. But here you go. So a good example is just I recommend 1 million to 1.2 million seeds per acre. It's pretty easy because you can actually look on the bag. Most of the triticale is sold with tags on the bag that'll tell you that there's 13,000 seeds per pound or whatever, 11,000 seeds per pound, and then here comes in fourth grade math where you just got to make a simple calculation to get 1.2 million. But this is a really good example of why you need to do that, because a variety like Thor and Surge, you're only planting 75% of that recommended population rate when you're only planting based on 100 pounds of seed per acre, which was for the longest time the recommended planting rate. And then in some years like Gainer, you're planting 11% over. So you need to prepare yourself to either crank your planter up to plant or crank your planter down. And if you have to crank your planter down, we probably saved you a little money, not on purpose, but we saved you a little money that year on the amount of seed that you need. So I think triticale, I'm always going to recommend planting population, not pounds per acre. All right, seed treatments. If there's no, is there any grazers in the crowd? No, it's always quiet. Oh, you got some graze? There we go. Okay. So what I've seen is if you have what part of the U.S. though? This may not even be a big deal. Okay, it still may not be a big deal. What we see in the Great Plains is it's still warm in the spring or in the fall, warm enough that we get a pretty good pressure of bird chariot aphid or mostly green bug. And those are the two vectors for barley yellow dwarf, and we could get some really early barley yellow dwarf infections. So I've always seen a recommendation or an addition of an insecticide with your fungicide that actually will kind of get it through that early stages. But for the most part, I recommend a fungicide solely for the increase in biomass. This is a study that we did. We were owned by Syngenta for 8 years because we were owned by a large company that makes probably a third of their profit off of probably 2/3 of their profit off of chemicals. We got to do a lot of chemicals trials also. The advantage of that was we actually found out that triticale is an over-responder, unlike wheat is not quite an over-responder, but triticale is definitely an over-responder to a fungicide application to the seed, so a seed treatment. And then We replicated this for 2 years over several locations in the Great Plains, and we could show you could see the significant difference in biomass. I think a lot of that probably has to do more with there's probably a little more junk in the soil early on that's affecting the seedling, but it actually can it's a strong enough crop that it gets through that, but it actually is taking a little bit of a yield hit. But we've seen there's a pretty significant advantage to doing a seed treatment for biomass. I'm gonna run through this real quick. All right, plant timing. Plant timing is everything. I think for us, there's a this is variable again across the region. What you guys do up here is not going to be the same they do in the east, the west, the south. But I can comfortably say I've done enough trials up here that I figured out if you can get your silage out in time. No, thank you. If you can get your silage out in time, the middle of September, 1st September, middle September is the sweet spot to get enough growth on it. But if you can't, try to get it done by the 1st of October. This is just an example of a trial we did. It's just a planting study. We took this picture of all of these October one, and you'll see here the bare spot we just planted, or we're fixing to plant. We hadn't even planted it yet. We're planted that day, October 1. And then this is a picture of the other plots that we planted for those different days. So the first week in September, that's how much growth you get. You know, that's basically 4 weeks worth of growth. 3 weeks worth of growth, 2 weeks, 1 week. So that it's a visual thing you can understand how much growth you can get on it within a month if you plant September. The importance of that is getting the growth on it, getting the crown developed, getting the root system developed so you can get through the winter. The winters that are getting pretty harsh. You need to give that plant an opportunity to survive it. There's a whole physiological process that they have to go through to gather sugars and to harden off so it can survive the winter. So the bigger that biomass is to get it before winter comes, you'll get a better jump on spring as well. If you're really far behind at 2 and 3 leaf stage and spring comes, I don't know if you'll have enough growing degrees to get a lot of biomass out that year. So late planting is not very advantageous for triticale. All right, sulfur deficiencies. This is a this is probably the biggest problem I've seen from a nutrient standpoint. I've had a couple of phone calls. I bet I've been on 6 or 7 of these in the last 2 years where they call me and say, "Hey, this field it's terrible. It's yellowing. It looks like crap. We slung fertilizer on it. Threw a little nitrogen at it, put like 40 pounds of N on it. It didn't do nothing. It's still yellow. It looks terrible." And so, for the most part, I've done it long enough that when they give me that phone call, I know what the problem is, but I'm going to go look at the field. And I look at the field and I tell them you don't have a nitrogen problem. You have a sulfur problem. When we cleaned up over the last 20 plus years, we've been cleaning up the atmosphere. And when we cleaned up the atmosphere, we got rid of the free sulfur that we were having from rainfall that was getting into the soil. Um, you thank EPA for that if you have soil deficiency of sulfur. But basically, it looks like a nitrogen deficiency, but if you look at the plant, it actually affects the younger leaves first, and then it moves to the older leaves. Versus nitrogen deficiency will affect the older leaves and then move to younger leaves. There will also be some marginalization around some of the plants if they're far enough along where it'll start getting brown and a little bit crispy looking. That's a nitrogen deficiency rather than sulfur. And I think the picture on the left with them grazing, I've talked about this because I live in big cow country, beef cattle country. They always tell me those are pea spots. See all that growing? That's where the pea spots are and where they poop. And I'm like, no, that's the only spot you have in the field that's got enough sulfur for you to actually grow a crop. So we'll test it, and again, it's always sulfur deficient. All right, so sources of sulfur. My recommendation is to put on an earlier. I had that slide where I recommend 40 units. If you do soil tests, or if you know how much sulfur is there, you can kind of balance that on how much you need to put. But I recommend putting on elemental sulfur at pre-plant, and elemental sulfur is really cheap, but it has to go through oxidation process in the soil, microbes, temperature, this whole process um, to actually be available to the plant. And then the plant can take it up. That could take 30 to 40 days um, for that process to work. And colder soils, it could take up to 60 days. But my recommendation is always to use elemental sulfur. Now, if you have a problem because of that takes 30 to 45 days for that process to be available to the plant. If you end up having a sulfur problem, you're not going to use elemental sulfur. The quick fix is ammonium sulfate, and ammonium sulfate is readily available to it immediately to fix a problem with sulfur deficiency. It is a little expensive at times. I don't know what ammonium sulfate's per ton up here, but at one point in time it got really high in the plains, and it become apparent that if they would just put a little bit of sulfur on up front, that they would have no problems, and rather than trying to fix a problem with an expensive application of ammonium sulfate. But again, ammonium sulfate will fix a problem because it's immediately available to the plant. And then if it shouldn't be a solution, because if you use a lot of ammonium sulfate back to back for years, you'll actually change the soil pH because it's got some acidifying reaction in the soil. All right, I'm going to skip this. Well, I'm not. I'll do a 2 minute talk or 5 second talk. This is just a chart that shows using a sulfur and how it actually affects protein. If you're really concerned about protein in the plant and that's kind of what you're after, then make sure you use sulfur. I'm getting short on time, so I want to get to the really important points. Harvest stage. This is where I talk. If stage 8, and this is the Feek scale. I don't use Feeks. I found out that people are more familiar with Feeks. I use a little more in-depth scale called Zadox. So if you look at our data on our website, it's in Zadox, and it's got 100 scales versus 10. Um, but I use this just an example will tell you when to harvest. So 8 is flag leaf for us. Flag leaf is when the flag leaf emerges fully out of the collar. That is the premium stage to harvest premium triticale. It's the highest quality that you can get in the field without giving up yield. You're going to give some yield up from all the later stages, but if you want premium product, that's the one you harvest at, and that actually is the stage that works really well, just based on the cold temperatures and environments you guys have up here. Again, you can move all the way into stage 10 through boot, late boot, early heading. You can even go to soft dough, but you increase yield by 35%, but you also drop quality. Lignin content starts to rise, protein starts dropping off significantly. Um, there's just and again, it's just whatever your end goal is. If you want to only feed dry cows, push it as far as you can. You'll get more tonnage. If you're trying to feed it to the milkers, you for sure enough want to harvest at that flag leaf stage. And this is just an example of the 35%, like how far. I did this trial a couple of years ago, and it's just to demonstrate the real numbers of how as we move through the maturity of the crop and how much more yield you can put on. That's it. I'm cutting it off there. Any questions? Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So that was planted. I'm just going off the top of the brain here. That was planted is a little later, and I wanted it last year. I think it was planted the first week in October, actually, last year. I planted Hillsboro 2 weeks ago, so which would be the sweeter spot for planting it. But it did get planted the first week of October. Uh, I want to say they were dry a little bit last year, and we were waiting on some moisture. I don't remember the case may be, but it was way later than I wanted to plant it. And I'm talking like it got planted October 1. And then the fertilizer applications, I'd have to go back and ask them because it's manure. They just slung manure on. I'm sure they know the numbers, but I didn't. Yeah, corn silage. We came right after. As soon as they got the corn silage off, and they got the field prepared. Yep, you bet. Man, I just stunned you with all the information. You don't even have questions. There is a quiz before you leave today. All right. Thank you, guys.